Afternoon, folks. I am Nathan Louder. I also work with the Soil Health Division and coming to you to do the cover crop management module today. Again, with the division since 2015, covering primarily from North Carolina all the way south to Puerto Rico. However, do have coverage over most eastern states. So I do come to y'all to about cover crop management, and I think what you have seen from all the other modules that you have seen today is that there's one thing that this all hinges around or pivots around, and I think that is the implementation of cover crops to be able to make these modules or make these soil health management systems come together. We're going to look at in terms of objectives for this module. We're going to list some of the benefits of actual cover crops. Also, within our discussion about cover crops, we're going to identify different plant functional groups where we will actually name 2 to 3 different representative species in each group that are common to basically the nation. We'll also list key benefits of some of these representative species within each functional group. And lastly, we're going to spend a little bit of time on how we would actually manage these cover crops because as you have seen through the earlier modules, management is key in making these soil health management systems work. So we have to identify, of course, firstly, our cover crop purpose. And we have identify resource concern here first, which is when we think of in terms of planters, that's what we're coming and addressing. We're looking for that resource concern to address with our conservation plan. However, there's one key thing we also need to be very aware and conscious of is that producer's objective because they may not see the erosion as being a problem or another identified resource concern. They may, have the objective that they want to do something else. So we may have to see how our resource concerns that are identified complement the objectives that we would like to see addressed with that producer as well. But what we see here is some several different things that cover crops alone could address as far as resource concerns and objectives. And I want you to think as planning staff on a daily basis with the conservation practices that you commonly use, just think about what they are able to address. And if you think about it, let's just say fence or let's say pipeline or watering facility or maybe even a terrace. Those are things that are singularly focused on what kind of resource concern they're going to address and what kind of benefit you may get from that. But when we think of a conservation practice like cover crop, the list here, this is a pretty extensive list, but there could even be additional things that could be identified where cover crop could provide some definite benefits. But things like crop diversity, I mean, we're providing additional habitat for that soil biology that we learned about earlier, but to where we can, make a more efficient opportunity to cycle nutrients, make more efficient opportunity to feed that soil biology just by including diversity in that cropping system through use of a cover crop. Our agency was built on addressing erosion. Of course, cover crops could be utilized to put, surface residues to armor that soil surface to where we could help alleviate the resource concern of additional erosion. Of course, when we have these living roots from these cover crops, we're able to build more stable aggregates. Of course, we created that habitat for that soil biology, and the roots also being in place, we're going to be able to increase that aggregate building opportunity. So we could also, when we build those more stable aggregates, we're actually creating a more favorable pore space within that soil profile, so we can actually build the opportunity to improve the water cycle and also make more water available for not only our cash crops but also those cover crops. We're actually creating opportunities to more efficiently harvest rainfall, or if for that matter, it could be irrigation water as well. Also, when we could utilize cover crops to also provide additional habitat that where we may be needing to address in an identified integrated pest management concern that we may have. Maybe we have a pest that we have identified a predator, but we just need the habitat for that predator to be able to be around. So utilizing cover crops to establish that type of habitat could definitely be of use by utilizing cover crops. Of course, building and or improving soil organic matter. If we think of our cash cropping systems, then we are having periods of where we have the cash crops. There's living roots in those systems, but a lot of times we may find that producers are not utilizing or capitalizing on the use of cover crops to keep living roots in those systems to help not only provide habitat but also build or improve soil organic matter. We have to have that interchange of roots and that soil biology or that interaction. Also, we have to have roots that are constantly turning over in that soil profile that are being cycled by that soil biology. Nutrient cycling and efficiency. A lot of these different resource concerns and objectives are actually, they just kind of tie on to one another, because when we have more biology, when we have a more diverse population of that soil biology, then we have more parties in that population that can help make nutrient cycling more efficient, because each one is playing a different part in cycling those nutrients in that soil profile. Of course, depending on where you are in the nation, air quality could definitely be a concern. I know I'm coming to you from North Carolina, so you don't think of wind erosion primarily from North Carolina. However, I can see not only wind erosion, but I can see sheet and rill water erosion as well. So just depending on where you are, cover crops could be utilized to help blanket that surface or cover that soil surface to where we can keep those soil particles in place. We have to think while we're planning also about the current cropping system that that producer may have. And we have to think about not only those crops, but also think about their CDN ratios. And this gives us a great opportunity to help adjust CDN ratios in these current cropping systems, because we're not likely to go out and ask that producer to change our cash crop. They may or may not have the availability of a market to do that, but we can adjust what cover crops we plant. So we could use, let's just say that it's a continuous corn operation. So that could be a high carbon component to the soil profile, and we need to offset that with a higher nitrogen component to where we could balance that CDN ratio. So, including a cover crop of higher legume components could help us adjust that CDN ratio. Also, cover crops could provide wildlife winter food and shelter if that is so desired by those producers or planters alike. And the next one is livestock integration, which is there has been some very good increases in soil health being built when producers are able to integrate livestock. However, depending on where you are, that really presents some challenges on how a producer may do that. We have to think about available infrastructure that is already in place or can be put in place. We also have to think about other things, infrastructure such as roads that are adjacent to some fields, or maybe even the shape of those crop fields that we would like to integrate livestock on. So I'm not saying that it can't be done. I'm just saying that we would need to really focus and think about the barriers or those challenges and how we could overcome those, just depending. Because I would think Delaware is a lot like the area I'm from, where we have odd shaped fields, we have roads, we have neighbors. So, having a group of stalkers in the neighbor's front yard at 2 o'clock in the morning, that could be a problem. But I think it can be done, and the infrastructure like temporary fencing and things like that have came a long way that will afford us that opportunity to be able to do it. Lastly, the last bullet, and we're actually going to spend a little bit of time on this in some future slides, is nitrogen fixation. And nitrogen fixation is one thing that really fascinated me from the start of soil health. It really got my attention because I saw the opportunity that I could actually be building fertility in the system just by planting something. Of course, corn and beans, you thought of a nitrogen credit after soybeans to a small extent. But then I could plant a cover crop of a bunch of legumes, let's just say 50% of a mix, and I could actually count on some of that fertility for my next cash crop, which is, I was like, that's a no-brainer. So let's do that. So nitrogen fixation is definitely a resource concern or objective that a producer may have that we could utilize cover crops to facilitate. Moving on. So if we're planting cover crops anywhere in general, the first thing we need to do is, as a planner, is consult the field office tech guide. We need to go to the field office tech guide for our state or for the state that you're in and actually pull that cover crop standard, because states do have the opportunity to modify or add supplemental information to those state standards when they're pulling those in. And we need to make sure that we are, as planners, working with the most up-to-date, latest version of the cover crop standard. And we have to think about, the first thing that we see within that standard is the purpose. And we see here on the screen: reduce erosion, maintain or increase soil health and organic matter, reduce water quality degradation, suppressing excessive weed pressures, improving soil moisture, minimizing soil compaction. And if we think back to that slide before, things that a producer may have or resource concerns that we may identify, those go hand in hand. And we can see where, as a planner, we can get this information to support us in our planning endeavors with these producers. So some things we need to think about in terms of successful planning for cover crops. There's several different considerations that we need to take into account. Things like site preparation. Do we need to start with a clean slate? Are we anticipating maybe some winter or summer annuals to come on as soon as that crop is harvested before we establish that cover crop? We have to think about the goal of that cover crop. Is that site preparation needed, or can we just utilize just planting into the existing residues or the existing site conditions? Because if we need to do that site prep, early weed control is really crucial. If Especially if those are very vigorous weeds or annuals that we're trying to outcompete with by planting that cover crop. If we're especially looking for a cover crop to be a nitrogen source, of course we want to support the best establishment of those legumes. So early weed control may need to be needed to where we can get a good start of those. So keep that in mind. Also, we should make sure that we keep the timing and the species. We need to make sure that we have an adequate growing season or adequate time period of that growing season that we can actually get the recommended intent of the cover crop that we're going to plant. Do we have enough calendar days left in that growing season to get those desired benefits? Also think about that crop rotation or diversity. We kind of mentioned that a little bit earlier. I want you to think about, because we're going to have, I think it is a knowledge check coming up several slides here in the future. We're going to ask about some seed quality things. We're going to spend a little bit of time on that. What is bin run seed? What is PLS? What is certified? And again, I want you to think about what kind of resource would I utilize to find out specific information for my state for those different criteria as well. We also have here later in the presentation some slides on different seeding methods. We'll look at seed to soil contact, talking about drilling versus broadcasting. Also can have that conversation about seed size and seeding depth. We also have slides that will talk about legume inoculation. And we have to really think about moisture management, cover crop benefits, and their actual water use, and how we, not only as planners, but the producers, could actually utilize the cover crop in many different ways to help them address this moisture management. And also, lastly, and I need to come back to this even more, is we as planners, when having these conversations with producers, we need to make sure we address those producers' goals. Additional things we need to think about in terms of cover crop planning is looking at the residue management. We're thinking about that cash crop. And I just took some photos for an additional module that we have. And we have to think about, what are we going to be planning into? What kind of residue is left after that harvest operation? Does there need to be some type of conditioning to support successful establishment of that cover crop? And we have to think about if we don't do anything, what could be some impacts about the emergence of that cover crop? And we touched on this a little bit earlier, nutrient cycling, thinking about the CDN ratio of that current cash crop and thinking about residual nitrogen. Was it a legume cash crop prior to? Can we count on capturing some of that residual inputs like nitrogen that could be utilized by our cover crop as well? We also need to think about weed and insect and disease management. We don't want to serve our producers the opportunity to transport disease from one cash crop onto a host of a potential cover crop and then onto the next cash crop. So we need to be thinking about what potential things could be there, what potential weeds could take access or opportunity of this opportunity that a cover crop is being utilized, and just think about those cycles of different insects and disease management. And we need to afford the producer the opportunity to break those cycles where we can. Termination method and timing, I can't stress this enough. As a producer that plants cover crops, one of the first things I'm thinking about is how am I going to kill it? When am I going to kill it? And there's a lot of different factors that play into that, a lot of different variabilities. Mother Nature may deal us different hands, and she usually does. Every year, every fall, we get a different hand, and every spring, we get a different hand. So there's no one cookie cutter method for termination or even planting. I think the thing that I have learned the most about trying to work through one of these systems is being flexible. And lastly, we're going to end a little bit on some impacts of economics. And when we're looking at different seeding methods, we actually have some economics that are tied to the cost of doing those operations per acre. So what is our seeding time frame? And again, just depending on where you are, what type of cropping systems you may encounter with those producers, you may have a multitude of opportunities to plant cover crops in a calendar year. But spring, coming out of fallow ground where we could be planting a cover crop. Also, spring could be where we have traditionally cash crops there. Maybe we have some prevented plant acres. Maybe, again, Mother Nature dealt us a very wet spring. Cash crops were not being able to be planted. So, hey, we got this opportunity to plant a summer cover crop now. Also, early summer, this could be after an early cool season vegetable harvest, could be after winter grain, could be after small grain forage harvest, or maybe even after some first crop hay. Really depends on the system that you're working in. I'm going to say, maybe not late summer for your area, but in some parts of the nation, we may actually have cash crops that are harvested early enough in the summer that we make it still accommodate the growing of a warm season cover crop into either a cool season grain or maybe even into a cool season cover crop. But what we find for the most part with most producers across the nation that a majority of the cover crops are planted after fall crop harvest. And that's where we have to be sometimes inventive on how we get those cover crops established. Maybe you say, well, we're so late in harvesting all of our cash crops that we just don't have enough maybe labor, or maybe we don't have enough growing conditions to support establishing a cover crop. So how can we address that in many other ways? And we'll have a couple slides that show some different ways that producers have tackled that challenge. So some things we need to think about in terms of seeding conditions or seeding considerations. Earlier seeding results in better seed germination just because we're planting those seeds into a warmer seed bed. That's going to support more tillering, more growth, more survival, and what that could in the end result in more biomass. But however, if we're not able to get that cover crop established as soon as we would like with that cash crop, and we do have that opportunity the next spring to delay that termination, sometimes we can compensate for that delayed planting in the fall. What I've seen here on my own is that if I can allow cover crops to get to that first 2 weeks of April, cover crop residues will usually double easily, triple, and sometimes quadruple in size just in those 2 short weeks of April. As soon as spring is breaking in my area, those cover crops get tremendous amounts of growth in a very short period of time. And a lot of times in the past, those cover crops would have been terminated weeks before I even got to that point. And that's still the case with a lot of producers. Be aware of planting dates based on species in the mix, warm season, cool season. Sometimes we have producers that are mixing those two different functional groups together. Also, we need to think about cool season legumes and brassicas. We have a slide that's going to touch on some of the challenges there, or maybe considerations for those brassicas as well. What we have found is drilling is really the most efficient in terms of getting seed established. May not be the most popular, but it is a lot more efficient than surface broadcasting and even more efficient than that of aerial broadcasting. So when we're doing any of the broadcasting methods, we need to increase that seeding rate by 10 to 30%. And again, this is a great opportunity for you as planners to consult your 340 standard and supporting information, because some states have specific or higher rates that are broken into individual groups like broadcasting or drilling. Higher seeding rates are not necessarily good, can be detrimental. And the thing I think about that is sometimes seeding cost makes it prohibitive to increase those rates very high, or it sometimes increase the competition in limited resources. So depending on the species in the mix, that could come into play if you increase that seeding rate. So we're going to take a look here at some different niches for summer annual crops. Of course, that's going to be the majority of the nation has a summer annual grain crop. And as you learned in the earlier modules about ecological management, about soil biology, is that we need to provide opportunities for that newfound livestock that every producer now has. We may have just been working with vegetable producers. We may have just been working with row crop producers. We may have been working with grazing producers or operations that were diverse that had both. But now, after sitting through this training, you're learning that every operation has livestock. They just may be very small and they may be in the soil profile. So if every operation has that livestock, we need to make sure that we are feeding or providing ecosystem services to not only that soil profile, but also supporting that soil biology. So we're looking in Block A. This is going to cover current practices. This would be a producer that has annual grain crop in the summer, and they're not currently using any cover crops, either before or after. So we can see from Block A that we are missing missing opportunities to provide those ecosystem services. And when I say that, we're missing opportunity to feed and support that soil biology to build soil health. So we can move on to actually sliding into B. We're working with this producer, and I would think about this producer as possibly being someone that is early in transition to the use of cover crops. So this would be a good opportunity for them to ease into this transition. So we still have our annual grain crop planted during the summer, but we came in after the harvest of this annual grain crop and then post-harvest drill seeded that cover crop. So we can see it was planted after harvest into fall. It gets some growth. It sort of plateaus during those winter months. As we come into spring, we can see that growth does get a lot more accumulation, and then we can see that we are terminating that cover crop prior to planting of that annual grain crop in the year. So we see, I would say that a lot of maybe no-till producers or conservation tillage producers that are just starting with cover crops, this would resemble them. But we can see that there is definitely more opportunity that we could increase more ecosystem services. So let's slide over here to C. So this is that producer that may have got a couple years under their belt, and they're going to push the envelope a little bit. So again, they have that annual grain crop, and then they post-harvest drill seed their cover crop after harvest, but then they come in and actually allow that cover crop to grow all the way up to planting of that annual grain crop. So this is a result in planting green. And I think the further you get north into your area, you have a lot of producers that are probably planting green just because of a shorter growing season for that annual grain crop. So we can also see that producer that may be pushing the envelope even a little bit further is actually coming into their annual grain crop and actually interseeding their cover crops into that annual grain crop prior to the actual harvest. So this could be done either with some type of high boy equipment, with some type of spreader, could be done by aerial service, or any other inventive way that a producer may get that cover crop seed out there. So it's actually getting started, say midsummer, and is growing, is getting started, germinated, and then we harvest that cash crop and basically release that cover crop to actually take off and growing because we are affording it full sunlight. And then we're getting that cover crop in, getting it a head start and actually giving it more of a jump on spring growth to where we can accumulate more biomass and actually terminating that cover crop before planting that annual grain crop. So we can see where we may have that innovative producer that is really, really pushing that envelope, where they may have interseeded their cover crops like this in D and afforded more growth, but then they even not only interseeded, but they also planted green. So this is really probably the most uh, uh, the most productive way to provide those continuous ecosystem services that a producer could do by having those annual or those continuous living roots in those systems. So what do we need to consider when we're thinking about different cover crop species? We need to think about the growth cycle. Is it an annual? Is it a perennial? Is it a biennial? What species are we going to be utilizing? And we need to also think about not only the growth cycle, the growth habit. Is it upright? Does it lay on the ground? Is it viney? Does it have, also thinking about the roots? Are they fibrous roots? Are they tap roots? And a lot of this comes back to what is the objective that we're trying to address? Is it something that we have identified as a resource concern, maybe like compaction? Or is it something that a producer has identified? Maybe they have problems with nematodes. So we can think about different things, and these different growth habits could provide opportunities for us to address that. We also need to think about growth rate of the cover crops that we're going to use, especially if we're putting those in a mix. We don't want to put one that is very slow to germinate, a very slow starter in terms of getting started and showing very visible growth of that cover crop in comparison to something that's very vigorous that could come up very rapidly and shade the ground and shade out those other species. So we'd want to try to avoid that. Also thinking about chemical composition, and this is where I should have mentioned that maybe that producer is looking for some way to address nematodes, or maybe they're looking for a cover crop that could provide them some allelopathic effects towards some troublesome weeds that they're having. We also need to think about stress tolerance. You think about the time of the year that we're going to be planting these cover crops, and also think about, are we anticipating a very wet part of the season or a very dry part of the season? And are the cover crops that we are planting, are they suited to those growing conditions? Time to flowering, we're going to spend a little bit of time on a slide about that. And pest resistance, we touched on that earlier as well. And do these cover crops offer opportunities for either being a host, or could they actually be detrimented by a pest that is in the area? So we have to think about different resources that we could, as planners, utilize to give us some of this information, like those characteristics. And this is an example of the ARS cover crop chart. If you want to find a copy of this, you can just easily in the search engine type in ARS cover crop chart. It would take you to their link, free download. And it's really a great resource. There's additional resources already in your office. You likely have managing cover crops profitably in the tech reference file. If you don't have it, again, another free download from Sayer that can be easily accessed online. But we have to, as planners, become aware of common cover crop species that we're going to be using in our area. A lot of times, as planners, as you start this movement in your area, you find that there could be a staple or a common list of 4 to 5 species. However, you're going to also encounter those producers that are on the innovative spectrum, where they may come in and say, well, I'm thinking about using sun hemp, or I'm thinking about using chicory or quinoa or lab. And we have to think as planners, where am I going to get that information? And for that matter, will that species even work in this system or in this part of the nation? Will it work? So the great thing about this kind of resource is that it's interactive to where you can click on one of those blocks and it will take you to a page like this. It gives you not only more information about that, it gives you things like the cool season. It's in that functional group. It addresses those characteristics that we were looking at. It gives you seeding depth, crude protein if it was going to be fed, CDN ratio, so you can use that to balance that in that mix. Tells you some forms of arbuscular mycorrhizal association, self-pollinated through wind, is rated very good at scavenging nitrogen from the soil. Not only does it give you that type of information, but it also gives you some pictures that can help you identify it, or maybe even give that producer an idea of what that is going to look like when it's growing if they have not utilized that source before. And then, of course, you can easily click and go back to your cover crop chart for another resource. So let's take a look at one of our first functional groups, and that is cool season grasses, annual ryegrass, cereal rye, barley, oats, wheat, triticale. I see producers using a lot of these. I would think the further you go south, usually one of these is a non-starter for a lot of producers, and that is annual ryegrass for us, unless it was in a grazing system or it was coming out of a bag with a specific label on it where it is highly known what that annual ryegrass is. But I know in a place where, like you are, annual ryegrass is likely very popular. Works really well in those more northern climates, but in our southern areas, that just seems to be potentially troublesome. So what I find is usually that cereal rye is probably the most popular amongst growers, and I would say that would probably be nationwide is probably the most favorable or most popular. But we have to think about cereal rye in comparison to others, and we have to think about where our producer is in terms of transition. Is this a conventional producer that is used to planting in a clean seed bed, or is this producer no-till and has several years under their belt of planting into some type of residue? Because the difference between cereal rye second week of April and barley second week of April is there's a huge difference in that. Usually several feet difference in biomass that is achieved. So if we have those producers that are earlier in transition, we may opt to use one of these species or one of these varieties that are lower growing. And then let that producer become more comfortable working into those systems to where we could actually move up to something like cereal rye, or maybe use that annual ryegrass that gives that super fibrous root system that could present a challenge to plant into sometimes. It's going to take that seasoned producer to be able to do that. Also thinking about warm season grasses, there could be that opportunity. A lot of times where I see this being implemented could be after those vegetable operations have harvested those cool season vegetables, or if you have a producer that has a set aside area in a grazing system to where they're utilizing maybe those cool season and then warm season annuals. And of course, they would want a warm season grass in that type of system. So things like pearl millet, Japanese millet, sorghum Sudan grass is very popular. One of the forage sorghums could also be popular. Something like teff, a lot of these could be popular. A lot of these have fibrous root systems, so we're supporting that soil biology by, also could be breaking up compaction, could be scavenging a lot of nutrients, and also building a lot of aggregates in these systems as well. Cool season broadleaves, we have things like radishes, turnips, rapes, kale, collards, mustards, phacelia, and a lot of these things have grown very popular in the past because of especially things like radish. And there's been so many different varieties of radish that have either been bred or selected for different traits. And we actually have a slide that's going to talk a little bit about that. But it's great that we have these other opportunities to increase that diversity as much as with different species like this. And also, not only could we be providing some great pollinator habitat, but we also could be providing something that we could either use for a forage for livestock, or even something that we could glean ourselves should times arise that we need to. So when we're using things like brassicas, it's very important that we know how and when cover crops are going to produce seed. And I'm going to say this, it doesn't really just solely tie to brassicas, because what is a weed? A weed is basically a plant out of place, right? So that could be a soybean in a cornfield, or that could be corn in a soybean field, or it could be a lot of radishes that went to seed during the growing spring, and then germinated and came back up in the soybeans. Ask me how I know that. Well, I learned I learned to your benefit at my expense, I guess you could say. So we need to know how and when cover crops are going to produce seed. So, cover crops that could go to seed could become a weed problem. And we have to think about those things like radishes. Radishes are photoperiod sensitive. So we have to think about the times of the year when we have longer days, those radishes are going to be triggered to set seed. So I'm not going to say, even though it says avoid spring or early summer, we need to understand that as planners and relate that to the producer. So there needs to be a termination strategy in place if those producers want to plant radishes when we have those longer days prior to them being able to set seed. Get those radishes terminated because they will likely make viable seed. Mustards mature quickly, so they could bloom in 45 to 60 days after planting. So be very cautious of that. There needs to be a plan in place before they reach that viable seed. Things like the turnips, the kale, the collards, the cabbage, and the rapeseed, they're all going to require vernalization. And vernalization, I'm sure you know, is where that plant has to go through a cold treatment through that part of the growing season to where it is then triggered to be able to set and make seed. Warm season broadleaves. So we have things pictured here like the top right, which is buckwheat, very popular in terms of pollinator. It establishes very quickly, gets a lot of quick growth. However, it does make a bloom and a seed very quickly as well. So if there are concerns about it becoming a weed, then of course termination would need to be thought about. Things like safflower that are on the bottom right and also sunflower could be included in warm season mixes to not only provide additional diversity, but also provide a excellent pollinator habitat in conjunction with things like the buckwheat as well. Cool season legumes, and again, these are going to likely be a lot of the staples. Things like vetch, whether it is the hairy, the purple, the common, the woolly pod vetch. And you may ask yourself, well, why is there so many different varieties of vetches? Just like I only have crimson clover here noted, but there are a lot of different varieties of crimson clover as well. And we find that with a lot of different species that there has been a lot of different varieties within that species that have been bred or selected for certain traits, and we'll actually cover that. But you can see crimson clover here to the right. The vetches are bottom left. We have the Austrian peas to our bottom right, and then we have one of the perennial clovers there at the center. And a lot of these are commonly mixed with our cool season grasses to help not only add diversity but also build nitrogen in these systems. Warm season legumes could also be utilized. We have things like cowpea to our top right, soybean. We don't have a picture of soybean, however, it could closely resemble that of cowpea. Sun hemp we have to our top left. That is becoming very, very popular amongst producers. Again, one thing that needs to be focused on if producers are wanting to use sun hemp is check not only your 340 standard, but also check state laws because some states do not allow the planting of sun hemp. So make sure you check those restrictions and regulations before that is utilized. Also, things like chickpea, mung bean, I think chickling vetch is in our bottom left, and also guar, which is in the bottom right. So again, warm season legumes, a great thing about these that not only do a lot of these provide great forage, they have a tremendous amount of growth in a short period of time. So we could get results out of them in a short period. So we, in terms of species that we would select for a short period of time in that growing season, things like the sun hemp, the cowpeas could really fit those types of windows. And not only do they get a lot of above ground growth, they also have the opportunity to provide and build a lot of nitrogen in that soil profile for a future cool season crop. So anytime that we're going to use legumes, whether they are warm season or cool season, it is very important that we consider the use of inoculation for these legumes. And you could ask when we're interviewing that producer if this particular legume has been planted there before. Then there could be some chance that that bacteria is already in the soil profile. However, I have always found it cheap insurance to make sure that I inoculate any legume that I'm planting. So when we do that, that's just going to ensure that we're providing that specific bacteria for the legumes that we're planting. And why would we want to do that? Because if we're spending the capital to buy usually a more expensive legume component of our cover crop, then more than likely, not only a diversity are we getting, but we want to make sure that it's going to produce that needed nitrogen for that system. So we have to make sure that that bacteria is there to where that association can be established. So also inoculants are specific to different species or varieties. So you would want to make sure you would source that correct inoculum for the species or variety that you're planting. A lot of times we find that usually the vendors that are selling the cover crop seed would also offer those specific inoculants for that species as well. We have to think about in terms of also relaying the message to our producers that those inoculants are alive and they have a storage life, and we want to make sure that we treat them uh, as they are alive organisms because alive bacteria are in those jugs. We may think of it as just a powder, but bacteria is there. So we want to make sure that we keep those inoculants refrigerated or out of direct sunlight, and we want to make sure that we use those prior to the expiration date. We find that a lot of producers utilize their mobile office or pickup truck for a lot of different things. Let's just make sure that it's not used to store those inoculants. So bin run seed is something that is very common that producers may want to utilize if they're planting cover crops. And there's a lot of things we need to think about in terms of considerations for planters. Just looking at this picture, let's just say we've worked with a producer. He's came in. We're going to plant a cover crop this coming fall, and that producer comes in and just puts this sample of seed on your desk on a piece of paper and says, "This is what I'm going to use for my grass component this fall planting." Then I'm going to include some other species with it. But as a planner, I would look at this and I would have a thought of what are some considerations? What topics do I need to cover with this producer if this was going to be utilized as a cover crop planting? So I see a lot of different things that could be troublesome if by using this. So let's just say they got this from a neighbor. It's cheaper than me buying maybe some certified seed or other seed that could come from a vendor. But we have to look at this. Look at all of the chaff. We still see some beards in here or chaff. There could be some damaged seed. There could be some fines. There could be some weed seed. We see here these little tiny specks. Those could be weed seed. So we definitely wouldn't want to be putting them back out on the land that we're utilizing to plant a cover crop. So at a minimum, as a planner, the conversation I would have with that producer is one, this seed needs to be cleaned in some shape, form, or fashion. Either you clean it on farm with some type of rotary screen, or if you have a seed cleaner, great. Or get this seed sent off to a commercial seed cleaner to where they can utilize and get a very clean sample. Secondly, I would want to make sure that I know what I'm dealing with. And when I say that, I think about the germination. Has this seed been sitting in the grain bin at the neighbor's farm for 2 years now? Is the germ 100%, 90%, 80%, 30%? I'm going to need to know that to where I can compensate that with on my seeding rate, right? So at a minimum, I need to either send this off to a state lab and get some testing done on it for germination, or you could do something as simple as a ragdoll test there in the office, wet paper towel, Ziploc bag, dark storage cabinet for a period of a week or so, and then pull that out, open it up, count the seeds that have sprouted, then you can determine what the germination is. And the reason I say consult your local 340 standard is because some states don't allow bin run seed to be utilized. So just make sure that the state that you're planning in, make sure that you review those considerations that the state is setting forward on the use of bin run seed. So certified or VNS, what is PLS also? These are questions that we need to ask, and you think about what are certified seed, and that comes into play a lot of times. Um, I usually think about certified seed when I'm planting maybe some warm season grasses or maybe some cool season small grains. A lot of times when you're getting into specific varieties that are traded, that you're looking for maybe a certified seed tag. Of course, the seed tag you see here is not the example of a certified seed tag. That is usually certified by some type of state agency. Usually the Crop Improvement Association would have a state tag. They're commonly blue in color and usually attached to those seed bags as well. So we have to think about VNS. So VNS is just opposite of what certified is. VNS is variety not stated. We have no idea what that variety of that seed is. We have a good idea of what kind of seed it is in terms of species. That could be red clover, but it could have Louder red clover in it, could have Carl Koch red clover, it could have Jamie Arthur's red clover in it. And you may say, well, why is that a problem? Or why do I care? Well, if a producer is looking for specific traits, they're going to want to make sure that they have certified seed, where they're looking for a red clover that is going to flower at a specific time or a specific days after planting to accommodate the cropping system that they're trying to utilize it in. But if that producer doesn't care when that flowers, because you could have some that flowers while some's vegetative, while some is already flowered in senesced, if it was variety not stated. You could have that different variation. But if that's when you would use VNS, if that producer is not looking for those specific traits. And we have to also lastly think about what is PLS. Well, PLS is pure live seed. And again, we want to go back to our 340 standard for our state and check what recommendation or what policy has set for that state and what is the seeding recommendations. Is it in PLS, pure live seed, or is it in simply pounds per acre in terms of developing different seeding rates? And we could figure PLS from this seed tag. You take things into account like the pure seed, the germination, the hard seed, and we figure those things up to determine what amount of pure live seed would be needed to accommodate a, say, 10-pound per acre seeding rate for something like red clover. And I don't know if maybe an experienced planter, you can look at this, and I see that I see some concerns of this seed tag already. Things like pure seed of only being 65.5%. Well, where's the other 30 some odd percent? Usually I would like to see this pure seed as being 90 some odd to 98% pure live seed or pure seed. But we can find information from the seed tag that tells us exactly what the other 34% is. That other 34% is coating material. A lot of times we find that our legumes, especially the small seeded legumes, are being coated, and they could be coated in different things. This one, the seed tag actually tells us that an inoculant used is a organic peat-based product. So that is that seed coating. So it also includes the inoculant, but also some peat that may facilitate seeding that smaller seeded species to where it takes up more room. So we need to know that, because a producer that wants to plant 10 pounds to the acre, because this is a 50-pound bag from the seed tag, 50-pound bag, and we're telling them that they need to plant 10 pounds per acre. Well, they're just going to say, all right, 50-pound bag, I'm going to do 5 acres. I need X amount of bags here delivered. But if we take that a step further and look at PLS, and we take in all these other considerations and factors from the seed tag, we'll actually find that this producer would need about 16 to almost 17 pounds of this seed out of this bag to get a 10-pound per acre seeding rate. So there's a lot of different considerations we need to think about in terms of planning and making those recommendations on a seeding rate, and just make producers aware of different seed tags and what those things could actually include. So now we have an opportunity for a knowledge check and a poll question. So we could get some participation from the room. So the question is, what are the 4 functional groups of cover crops? So one of those are warm season grasses.
Cool season grasses.
Cool season grasses, warm season broadleaf, and cool season broadleaf. So I mentioned earlier that cultivars may vary. And again, this is really based off of what the producers are looking for in terms of addressing objectives. So we could see things like, let's for instance, the crimson clover. So I mentioned that a producer may be looking for clover that could go to flower earlier than, say, that of Dixie Crimson. So I'm going to say that the standard is usually Dixie Crimson clover. And these AU species that were developed by not only our plant material centers, but also Auburn University, they actually were bred or selected to mature earlier. And what we could do is, and you may say, well, why do we want those to mature earlier? Because when they make 50% flower, then we are getting that majority of the nitrogen that clover is going to be able to provide us. So that may fit that window of that producer that is going to plant an earlier corn in comparison to the Dixie or even the variety not stated that could be utilized. Also thinking about things that may differ in terms of the radishes, things like ecotil or driller or sodbuster. Those could be utilized to focus, they could have been bred to focus on compaction alleviation, while things like control or defender may have been developed for nematode control. And things like graza or lunch could be bred more as a forage radish that could be supplemented for or used for supplemental grazing. So we can see that there's a lot of variations and differences here. In cereal rye, we see that same thing. A lot of times we see that a Brucey, Elbon, Wheeler, a lot of them are very common. I doubt we're going to be planting Florida 401 in Delaware. So a lot of different considerations should be taken into account when selecting a specific species or variety. So how will we seed it? Drill it. That's what I'm going to start with. We're going to hear from producers. It's the most time consuming. It's going to cost us somewhere around $16 to $18 per acre to do it. Provides row plant spacing, consistent results, and it usually results in good seed to soil contact. You can see some results here from a different mixture that was planted. Looks like a cool season grass and a cool season broadleaf. You may have a producer that attaches an air seeder on a harrow or some type of vertical tillage rig. This is popular with some producers that may already have this type of equipment and can add a specific piece like the air box or the air delivery system. very fast. They can usually travel as fast as someone can sit in a tractor seat. Uh, we get the comments that it is cheap. However, when we did some looking, that is $17.30 per acre. Plus, it would cost $12.50 per acre to broadcast it if that was done as a separate operation. That you broadcast it and then had the vertical tillage or a harrow. But we could just lump those in to that 1730 per acre if it was all combined in one operation. And I think it's worth saying that the dollar figures that you're seeing per acre here are for the operation only, not including any seed, because there could be a lot of variation in the amount of cover crops that are seeded per producer. The things about the air seeder on the harrow or the vertical tillage provides random plant spacing. And if we're trying to minimize disturbance as meeting those soil health principles, this one will include some soil disturbance. Flight on is very flexible in timing, especially if you have fair weather. This is very fast, of course, as well. $12 to $18 per acre. It's going to provide random plant spacing. No seed to soil contact is going to be guaranteed, and it's going to really be moisture dependent. So if we can get those cover crops broadcast on aerially ahead of a rain, then that could be very, very good and very, very successful for the producer. But if we fly it on and then it stays dry for several weeks, we may not have the best desired stands that we would be looking for. Sometimes higher seeding rates may become impractical. And some other things that we need to think about is the objective or also the resource concern that we're trying to address. Let's just say that weed suppression is the objective and or resource concern that we're trying to address by utilizing a cover crop, and we choose or the producer chooses to fly it on. So I would think this would actually be a better opportunity to plant a cover crop with maybe a drill or even ground broadcast, just because we may have more opportunity to ensure a uniform stand that would help us address and achieve that weed suppression. Because to weed suppression, we got to intercept the sunlight to where we're not affording that weed seed light to germinate usually. So we want that very uniform, thick stand of cover crop on that soil surface. Also, when we're flying different cover crops on, we need to make sure that we source a good pilot. We don't want our cover crops that could sometimes be costly. We don't want them seeded in the road. We don't want them seeded in the neighbor's field. We don't want them seeded in the woods. We want them on, every square foot of the field that is in target to get those cover crops being put on. Here you can see some examples of cover crop that was flown on into standing beans or beans that were probably likely at leaf drop when they were starting to yellow. And as those are drying down, we can see where that cover crop is being released because we can get sunlight. One thing, a consideration that I would take into account here, Mother Nature could throw us a curveball with this type of system. Let's just say we get those seeded and then we have a wet fall. Then we get a tremendous amount of cover crop growth after the soybeans have uh, already senesced. So that cover crop could actually grow up into the canopy to some extent into those soybeans. And with the method of soybeans being harvested really low to the ground, then that could become an obstacle, barrier, or challenge with the individual that is harvesting those soybeans. Would it harm the cover crop? Not likely. It would just snip it off and it would regrow. We also see some additional pictures here is some that was aerial seeded into corn. So the sunlight or the shade is being suppressing that cover crop. And then when the corn would be drying down or harvested, then it would full sunlight would reach the ground, that cover crop could grow. So we also see a high boy for establishing into standing corn. I think producers in your area could be utilizing a piece of equipment like this. This is a picture from Dave Brandt's farm down in Ohio. Again, you're challenged with a shorter growing season, so producers are looking for ways to get that cover crop established as early as possible. So aerial seeding was one way. Also, running into that standing crop could be another. So we can see some pictures of this. Of course, standing corn, may not be the most popular, but producers are doing it. However, you could do this in things like soybeans or other low-growing crops that you could still get through with that piece of equipment and get that cover crop seed established. Also, producers doing tandem operations or combinations of things in one pass across the field. We see here that a producer has put a Gandy airbox or some type of airbox seed delivery system onto the actual corn header or soybean platform, to where the seed is delivered to these diffusers right here on the bottom of the corn head or grain platform. See producers that are using this in combination, to where they're utilizing the harvest operation and also combining the seeding operation with that as well, delivering that seed either under the platform or corn head, and then it is being covered by the chaff coming out of the combine. So you can see some examples of ryegrass and crimson clover being established there. Does provide that opportunity to save time, because they're doing all of this harvest and planting all in one operation across the field. Also, producers may utilize existing planting equipment that they have, like a precision planter. This is somewhere around $12 to $18 per acre. It's going to provide precision row plant spacing, good consistent results, and good seed to soil contact. This may also offer that producer that has an objective. Let's say that they're doing strip till and they want to substitute maybe a cover crop to substitute that strip till operation, or that strip till pass. So you can see that in this picture that we have in alternating rows, looks like you have a brassica of some sort or cool season broadleaf that could be substituting that ripper shank or that subsoiler pass, and then other rows or row middles are being utilized with some type of grass that could shade those row middles. This is a piece of equipment that is developed by Penn State. It's an interseeder. They can see going into standing corn around V6 or so, establishing that cover crop. This could be done in tandem with another operation, like some type of herbicide pass or maybe even a fertility pass for that cash crop. It's affording that opportunity for that cover crop to be established, but the shade of that of cash crop above it is going to suppress it throughout the growing season until that crop starts to dry down. And you can see pictures of that bottom right, that the corn had been harvested and the cover crop has had a really good jump on growing, or more opportunity to that growing season. So planting green, that is something that I would caution producers on doing, especially if you don't have opportunities or experiences with doing this in the past. And there could be some challenges with this, and there also are advantages of this. We covered those in those niches of providing ecosystem services that we're planting green because we're keeping living roots. We also provide opportunities for increased biomass, because we're not only allowing that cover crop to grow longer, we're also providing more cover, and also getting that cover crop or that cash crop established into that. We also see better planter performance in this standing cover than we do in a thick mat that may be laying on the ground, because you would really have to think about compensating for that in terms of seeding depth if you have a very thick mat of a couple inches of residue laying on that soil surface. Also, when we are able to achieve more biomass in that cover crop residue, we can help reduce evaporation and also protect against erosion. Some things in terms that could be looked at as disadvantages could be increased pest pressure. If that cover crop contains pests that are using that as a habitat or a host, then that could easily be transitioned over to that next cash crop. Planting green, it really depends on what type of equipment that you're using and what kind of cover crop you're planting into. As long as most cover crops are really fresh green, I don't see many of these disadvantages really happening. The most time I see that these disadvantages really show their head is when that cover crop is in some variation of termination. And let's just say maybe we haven't terminated it as a producer, but maybe it's nearing its growth end of its growth cycle. So it could be naturally dying down. And either if it's in that state, or if a producer has terminated it maybe a week or so ago, that really provides the opportunity for more risk of wrapping on planter drives, wheels, and hairpinning, just because in that phase of that residue uh, uh, drying down or trying to dry down, it becomes very, very tough. So we would really want to make sure that we educate producers on opportunities when we can plant. We plant either fresh green residue, whether it be standing or not, or completely dry residue, and nowhere in between, because that risk of wrapping on planter drives, wheels, hairpinning, been there, done that. That's no fun, digging out all that residue from different planter drives, or pulling out the end of a row in a turn row, and your planter is just covered in residue. Overutilization of moisture could definitely be a disadvantage if allowed to go to that point. However, we could use cover crops at our advantage, to our benefit. If we have a very, very wet spring, we could utilize those cover crops to pull out that excess moisture in those times. So we could use that both ways. Cover crop termination methods, things like herbicide burn down, tillage, frost termination, crimper roller. We want to make sure that that residue is mature enough that we would actually kink the stem. Usually for small grains, that's going to be at soft dough. Legumes, that could need to be usually at 50% bloom or higher. Grazing could be utilized to terminate, but it's not going to be a lot in most of the state guidelines. Shredding or mowing may be very, very popular amongst vegetable producers, but I'm going to think that a lot of time we find that usually a combination of these above methods are utilized in terms of termination of different cover crops. Cover crop termination, how and when? I'm really going to think that us as planners need to have the conversation and have the knowledge about where our producers are. So, if that producer is the clean seed bed, conventional guy, we may want to get cover crops terminated earlier. If they're more seasoned, more experienced, then Katie bar to door. Let that cover crop residue get huge. Precision equipment has offered us a lot of different capabilities to plant into different things, uh, like like different down pressure settings, row cleaners, GPS guidance. So a lot of times this big residue doesn't get in the way of a more seasoned producer. So the big thing is here is to have that game plan, and also think about what Mother Nature gives us. A lot of times it could be flexible. We may be terminating early, or it could be terminating late, just depending on what happens within that growing season. Cover crop herbicide restrictions, and I'll be the first to say that this really I struggled as not only a planner and producer. There just wasn't a lot of information out there about cover crop restrictions on herbicides. But you may be thinking about working with a producer, and you tell them to plant X, Y, and Z cover crop, and they come in the office, a couple weeks later and say, "Well, I planted that cover crop, but half of it didn't come up." They may show you a picture like this on their phone and say, "Well, what happened?" And we're just sitting there scratching our head and think, "Well, I'm not certain, but let's look into it." And this could be a picture that resembles some herbicide effects on species that can be utilized. And that's one thing that I find across the nation is, with increasing herbicide resistant weeds, we're finding that producers are using more and more residual herbicides. So we really need to be conscious as planners about what herbicides are being used, and then what effects those could play on different species that we're planting. Again, you're not going to find you're going to find that some labels still lack some information. However, a lot of labels are getting a lot better at including this and giving you some type of plant back intervals. There will also, if livestock are being integrated, there are forage restrictions that you would want to consult as well. Things in terms of these herbicide persistence, challenging predict those carryovers of those herbicides. A lot of times it may just utilize your experience in your area with those cropping systems and the herbicides that are being used. But when in doubt, perform a bioassay. See what is actually in that soil profile that may be active, and then you can make some determinations on how that could affect those different species. Termination guidelines. This is a map from RMA on crop insurance for Delaware. It looks like you're in zone 4. So terminate cover crop before the actual crop emerges would be where you would fall in terms of getting that cover crop determinated. Also, there has been a lot of opportunities for us to increase, uh, you know, correspondence back and forth with different agencies. And RMA has done a really good job, I think, in terms of addressing cover crops because now they have a standalone cover crop page that addresses cover crops and implications of crop insurance. So be sure to check that out as one of your resources. Other cover crop planning tools, of course, the 340 standard for your state. I'm sure you're aware that cover crop councils have been started. There's a Northeast, there's a Southeast, there's, of course, Midwest has been around for some time, and also a Southwest and Northwest cover crop that is being established. So expect to see some good resources coming from those. Resources and publications, us at the Soil Health Division are trying to develop fact sheets and other resources to help field office staff where they can be better suited to utilize cover crops in their planning activities. But the biggest thing is just make sure you as planners just take that opportunity and try to self-educate yourself. Attend different field days, look at maybe some different industry things online, but just educate yourself about different opportunities and different species that could be suitable for use in your area. Last thing I'll just say, when we can utilize cover crops, we're able to not only protect, but also feed that system and utilize and achieve all of the 4 soil health planning principles. And with that, that is the end of the presentation on cover crop management.
Nathan, I did want to point out, I mean, we've got everything, here in Delaware. We've got, gosh, what has it been, 20-year history of cover crops here. We've got a fairly robust district cover crop program in each of the counties. And then also the Delaware Department of Agriculture is also kicking money in for cover crops here in the state as well, in addition to, funding we do through the Environmental Quality Incentive Program through EQIP as well. So we've got a long history of cover crops. We've got folks that are, on the very top end of things with planting green. One of the gentlemen we're going to go see on Thursday, Jay Baxter, is one of our soil health champions, and he's kind of on the cutting edge with planting green. And he's always, for you guys that know Jay, he's always asking the questions: what's next? Where do I need to go next? And he's kind of leading the way in our area to, guys that are, getting it, in late and killing it off as early as possible. So we've kind of got the gambit here. I know one thing that has come up recently is, we've got some allowances for nitrogen applications to cover crops in our state. And I didn't know if you had any experience with that or heard any other states that were allowing applications to cover crops in their states, and kind of what your feeling is on that.
So you're saying actual fertility applications to the cover crop?
Yes. Yeah.
All right. So what I have seen in, I know some of the areas that include really sandy soils, there could be recommendations for some fertility to be applied to get those established. But when you get into anything where you have a heavier soil, I haven't seen any recommendations on fertility to those cover crops.
What if you had a vegetable crop that was done early, and say, like here in our area, July, you had an open spot and you were preparing to do an early sowing of, say, radish in August. So maybe you had like a month go by between terminating your vegetable crop, doing an August seeding, and you had something specifically like oxalis show up and just blanket the whole field. Would you leave that and utilize it as a cover crop? Because it's kind of in the way to do something else. It's completely covering the field, like almost like you planted it. Would you keep that in place and go with oxalis, or would you kill that and then go with your chosen cover crop?
I would definitely have to look first at what could be the benefits of leaving that. Is that species going to provide any benefits? Of course, you would think if it's coming up monoculture, then we are limiting ourselves that way. However, think about the alternative. There's going to be inputs to terminate that. We don't want it to lay there uncovered. So just really weigh the benefits and see if it would warrant planting an additional cover crop that may include multiple species in that short period of time. But still, that time of year you could establish, things like sun hemp and maybe one of those warm season grasses and get a lot of growth in a short period of time. Especially if you have rainfall that catches it there or adequate soil moisture.
Nathan, do you have a favorite cover crop selector tool online?
Actually, I usually revert back to what Gene Hardy told me, which is a retired agronomist from the East National Tech and Support Center. There are, some great selector tools out there. Hopefully, the cover crop counselors are going to have not only a selector tool or decision tool, but also a cover crop mix builder. But I usually just go with his rule of thumb is take the number of species, their full rates, and divide it by that number of species plus one. And I've used that for forever in developing the cover crop seeding rate on our operation. But I don't have a favorite industry one. No, I do not.
Yeah, and Nathan, you did mention the cover crop councils in each one of the regions, and I know they, at least know in the Northeast, they've been working on that for a while. Have you heard when that might finally come out? I heard last fall that it was going to be this spring, but I didn't know if you had any updates on that cover crop calculator.
I think there is a version of the decision tool for the Northeast because I know I've been participating in data verification for the Southern Cover Crop Council for the decision tool. So I would check their website because there's some version probably already available.
Thanks, Nathan. It was very informative. We appreciate it.
Thank y'all.